Hey everyone, thanks again for tuning into OTRAM's YouTube channel. Today we're going to finish up the 80 series high and low range gear install for the T-case. In part one we did the actual gears and bearings swapping and teardown. So this one we're going to clearance the case and reinstall everything. So what we've got to do first, I've got my bearing race temporarily reinstalled in here along with its retainer and shim, so that when we drop the gear cluster in, we get the right height and we know we've ground enough out. And basically there's a sheet metal oil slinger here that we've got to cut the vertical edge off of. And then this boss here, we're going to trim back. Most of it's going to be along the extension of this rib. We're going to cut that off and smooth out down here to give our gear more room to drop down. And we're gonna grind and then drop in and test fit and go back and forth like that until we've got a good fit. So let me move the camera over till you've got a better view of me actually cutting, and we'll come back. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and put my face shield on and earplugs in, and we'll get to cutting. Okay, we'll get that blown out, and now we can drop in our gear cluster and see if we've trimmed enough. And we have. I've done a couple of these, so I've gotten a pretty good idea of what we've got to cut. The first few I did, it took me like 5 or 6 back and forths to get it clearanced right. But you basically just want to make sure that your gear teeth have plenty of clearance at this boss here. As far as the slinger goes, you're just basically cutting the vertical off, and then I just smooth it down so that there's no little hang-ups to catch and wear out or break off and go through the gear oil. So we'll go ahead and put that guy back over on the bench so it's away from all the grinder grit. And then we've got the rear portion of the case. Let me zoom out a little bit. The rear portion of the case, same idea. We're just going to trim this edge off and smooth it out just like the other one. Come on. Okay, and there's our case halves all trimmed. I like to go ahead and round this corner of the sheet metal, otherwise you get left with a sharp edge. Just leaves one less thing to cut my hands on when I'm putting it together. We've blown this out, so we're going to take these two case halves, run them through the parts washer again to make sure all the grit's blown out of them, and then we'll come back and start disassembling. Okay, so we've got all of our transfer case components back out of the parts washer now. All the metal grit and everything has been cleaned out, blasted out, and we're good and dry now. What I didn't show on camera when I was disassembling was I took the front extension housing off. I took it off, one, to make it easier to clean everything out, to make sure there was no grit, and two, because I was doing the oil seals. I did the input or the two output oil seals, and I also did the input oil seal here where the transfer case meets up to the transmission. So now we're ready to start reassembling. I've already wiped these surfaces clean. So now we can get out our Toyota seal packing. We can run a bead around here. There we go. And we can just flip this over, and you want to hold the shift rail when you do it. Otherwise it wants to drop down and the shift rail just goes in the hole there. Peek down in there, make sure everything stayed where it's supposed to be. Let me go grab my plastic mallet to knock that down. There we go. And I'm just going to lightly snug those up for now. I'll come back and torque everything up once everything else is together. So now we can flip this guy over and we can actually start building the inside of the case. So I'm going to take my input shaft and I'm going to grease the outside of it where the seal rides. Then feed that in there gently. There we go. Then we can take our other shafts. We can take some grease and pre-lube the bearings. I'm actually going to lay a paper towel down to set those on. Then we'll do the same for the output shaft. And this is just to give them a little bit of lube before all the gear oil works its way in there. There we go. And these kind of just mesh together. Like so. And then you pick them up as a unit, and they're heavy and awkward. And then as you're dropping this in, you'll work the shift lever into place, and it'll all kind of hop in as one happy unit. And then I just like to make sure that my shift rails actually will shift somewhat while I'm putting that together. Just to double check that I've got everything in there the right way around. And then we're going to take and clean the case half down here. We're going to wipe the big chunks of grease off. Come on. And I find it easier to prop it up on a block of wood for putting the back half on. We'll wipe our case halves down again. And then we'll wipe this other half. You just want to get all the oil residue off of these so that when we put the glue on, that it sticks well. And I've got somebody at the front door, so let me go check with them and I will be right back. Okay, it was just a parts delivery. So now we can run sealer around this case half. It's still a bit cold here in the shop this morning, so this stuff doesn't want to flow. Okay. Okay, so the idler gear was just slightly caught against the input gear, and it just took some more finagling to get it down in there. So now we can put our rest of our cover bolts on this side. And I can never remember which one of these gets sealer, so I just put sealer on all of them. Excuse me. Okay, and now that you've got your two case halves loosely together, spin your input, or spin your output rather, and just make sure you don't have any binding. There we go. Now we got one more short one here. Let's stick that guy in there. And let me go grab a brass punch, and I'm going to knock this race a little bit further in to give me room to put the shim and the cover plate on. Actually, it's right here. And then if we just take a little grease and dab a couple globs of it on the outside of that bearing race, we can take our shim and it'll stick to that grease and stay put. Then we can put our retainer bolts back in. I'm going to clean those off real quick. And then wipe the face of the retainer off. Put a little Loctite on there. Also make sure your high-low selector is still functional. I think these are 27. Let me go check the torque spec real quick. Okay, so it's 28 foot-pounds on the retainer bolts. I was thinking it was 27 because these guys are 27s. Okay, at some point the camera turned off and I'm not exactly sure where. So what we've done, we've got the idler gear, we got the whole gear set back in. We've wiggled the outer case back on, and these are loosely installed. The big shim is back behind this retainer plate now, and these are torqued up to 28 foot-pounds. I've put some grease on the shims that hold this little bearing pack in to hold that in place. And we've made sure that our shift fork moves freely, and we've also spun our, oops, wrong one. You can stick your finger through here and couple these and make sure that the low range gear spins without binding on anything in the case, now that we've got it all torqued up tight. So now we can put the rear extension housing on. We've just got to clean up the back of the case here. Especially where I just smeared grease. Oh, and I also put the little drive gear back in. I smeared grease on the end of it to hold it in place. So let me just come back behind myself here and clean up the rear housing. Okay, now we can put the rear housing on. And this part's kind of fun because you're trying to line up the splines of the output shaft without the little oil pump doodad falling out. I'm really good at making this fall out. There we go. There we go. Whew. Sometimes they just want to fight you going back together. our block of wood. Okay, so we've got all those loosely installed. And again, we're going to make sure that everything spins freely. Now we can take this small bearing retainer snap ring and stick it in here like so. And then we'll clean this mating surface off. We'll add our sealer. And this one, you want to crisscross and go in slowly because it's seating that back bearing. And if you get it cocked, you could crack this back cover. So there's that guy in. Get some of this goo off my hands. Now we can come back up front here. And then what I'm doing here is when I took this out, I had the center diff lock in the open position, so I'm just making sure that I'm back in the open position. There's locked, and there's unlocked. So we're good there. So I can take our small ball bearing and drop that down that detent hole. Drop its retainer on top. Put a little bit of sealer on the Allen cap, or the Torx cap rather. Snug that down. Look down the hole, make sure that we're all the way forwards again, just to be sure, because it's not fun to have to pull the motor back out once you put it in. We can drop our gear down in there. Excuse me. And we'll wipe this surface. And the one on the motor. And we can put some sealer on. And we can turn ahead and drop the motor in. Making sure it drops onto its gear properly. And we can put our motor bolts back in. And look down here one more time to make sure that we're in the unlocked spot. And we are. So we're good there. So the next step would be to torque all these to 27 foot-pounds, all the bolts we just put in. I'm not going to bore you with going around and torquing all the bolts. And I missed that wire retainer. That should be sitting on that clamp there. So before I forget, go ahead and pop that back in. So all the 14 millimeter headed bolts we just did get torqued 27 foot-pounds, and then we'd put the 2 sensor plugs back in, or 3 rather, I'm sorry. I forgot to order the crush washers that go under these, so I'm still waiting on those to come in from Toyota. But just refer back to your pictures when you pulled them out to see which one goes where. Stick those back in, and then it's ready to go back up in the truck. Yeah, and then you get to enjoy underdrive high range and lower low range. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please subscribe below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.